Hello, in this video I want to continue the conversation that we've been having about settler colonialism and the worker strike. I really enjoyed doing this resolution because I definitely think that it's given me a really interesting perspective to look at in terms of how this resolution is developing and what types of criticisms make sense in terms of what are the most prominent ones that will show up on the worker strike resolution, and what types of strategies teams really need to be prepared for, slash like what types of arguments should teams be looking for if they're trying to figure out what types of core arguments and ideas they could be kind of like reading in order to figure out like what they should be kind of like using against other teams. And so hopefully this series has been helpful overall. In the last couple of videos I started talking about what I think about settler colonialism on the affirmative as a criticism of the resolution, and what I think that looks like in terms of the best form of it, and then what it really looks like against things like case arguments, framework arguments, counter plans, disads, and criticisms. And in this video I kind of want to continue on in terms of talking about how teams can better answer settler colonial criticisms on the affirmative from that position. So when you see settler colonialism on the affirmative, what types of negative responses really make the most sense, and what portions of the criticism you should really be focusing on in order to generate good offense and nuanced offense against the affirmative that doesn't really feel repetitive of a lot of like the recycle stuff that I think people could read. And so hopefully I think that this resolution really gives the opportunity for people to think about a different way of theorizing like the state at a theoretical capacity, and the various ways that people like interact with the idea of sovereignty, and hopefully that can give Slate to like a different set of like ways to answer arguments like this, and ways to also kind of explore that argument. And so hopefully whether you're reading this argument or trying to answer these next couple videos will still be helpful. The place that I kind of want to start is just like, what are your priorities overall in terms of how you should be answering these kinds of arguments? I think that in general the places where I would start in terms of what stuff is best to read is really trying to figure out the way in which you can kind of like figure out the biggest place in which you can build clear differences between your theory of the way in which the state and various forms of violence operate in relationship to like the state as a concept, and the ways in which you can kind of like differentiate yourself from the affirmative in order to really push in questions of mutual exclusivity. I feel like in a lot of these places there's so many arguments that teams will really make in order to like set up a way of transitioning their arguments about their critiques of the sovereign and their normative critiques of just how colonialism kind of arrives through various moments in time, and using it in order to win that either their theory is like close enough to yours in order they can like subsume it through things like a permutation and various arguments like criticisms, or that they can kind of like win if there's a possibility that the way in which they're kind of like studying and archiving the resolution has basically pinpointed a kind of like crack in the structure that your way of theorizing the world doesn't really identify, and makes theirs kind of preferable through the various forms of like impact comparison that they'll try to implore. And so I feel like trying to like build yourself a strategy that is able to really densely disagree with the kind of like theoretical way in which they're studying the world is really a primary place to really start off your kind of like disagreement with the affirmative in the first place, and a place where I think is good for you to like start thinking about what types of options you really want to make it to the end of the debate. I then think the next thing that you really want to ask is, what is your relationship, or what is your kind of like status on the value of the worker strike and the status of the value of the state as a whole? If you think that both of those things are things that like you really don't want to endorse as well, then you really need to find other ways in which they're historicizing why those things exist is wrong. But on other places, if you really want to disprove them, I think that you need to put a lot of work early in trying to kind of like impact turn the way in which they're kind of like staticizing the notion of what the sovereign, what the worker strike could look like in relationship to like a possibly like narrow understanding of like what settler colonialism is and its expansiveness, and the necessity of being able to like engage those types of institutions in order to create various forms of material change that I think are definitely important to the types of conversations that you'll kind of want to be pushing with these types of arguments. I think that when we kind of transition this into what types of case arguments are the best to read, I think that we really want to push the ball on like what does their method kind of do to produce an alternative to what the resolution is asking for. I think that that kind of like pushing them on method explanation is helpful no matter what criticism, or I mean no matter what negative position you're going for in general, because I think that the more you get clarity in terms of like what their method is supposed to produce outside of just kind of like the reading of the 1AC, the better idea that you can get not only for what offense you want to read, but their kind of like alternative to the organization of what the worker strike etc looks like. And that lets you know the kind of like organizational structure at a method level that you should be trying to like build a lot of your offense off of. I feel like most times you can kind of bait teams into like getting more creative with their exploration if you just push like a lot of arguments about like presumption and the way in which they kind of, and trying to non-unique their solvency, and win arguments about why it's related to things that are already happening in the status quo, and make arguments about how like the resolution kind of poses a different question about what a different kind of entity for these things could be. And I think that forcing them to kind of do that can make them like have to dive into their method explanation more and give a more nuanced explanation of what those things look like. I then think that being able to then build in some arguments on cases about like what you kind of want your impact comparison to be later on, outside of obviously if you're going for something like a framework framework T debate in terms of how you want the judge to value what types of impacts they should be using to think about like the way in which their ballot kind of relates to the question of what type of like method they should be taking up in relationship to the resolution, because I think that entering those framing questions really early on and right next to where the affirmative is kind of like doing a lot of their work can make it a lot easier for you as a negative team to kind of like use it not only as a cross application for whatever argument you want to go on later, but also to go for it independently as a critique of the type of study that they may be doing if they try to move away from the kind of like method debating that I was kind of like citing and talking about a little bit before. I think then when you move on to things like the framework and T debate, it really becomes a question of how you're able to win that the resolution, regardless of whether or not you're able to win that sovereignty is able to completely sever its ties from its relationship to settler colonialism, is still valuable to debate about because of like the possible necessity of things like the workers' strike and the proximate kind of like ways in which it educates us about the relationship and the historical relationship between various types of like movements and like the state as a structure. I feel like a lot of the best arguments to really make in terms of really justifying framework and T in this case is making arguments about how the kind of like justification that the affirmative we use for offering an archival study would basically open up the canister for various other analytics of the resolution that don't actually make a change in the content in the context of like the conditions of various workers, and why not being able to like have a debate that really is able to center that is kind of valuable to really being able to think about how we are able to theorize other conditions of violence, and how kind of like eschewing that conversation can stop a really like developed in-depth debate because of the way in which it kind of like basically underlimits the way in which the resolution is being viewed, and then you can kind of link that to a lot of the other procedural norms that you would kind of be using normally if you were going for a tier framework argument. But I think it's really important also to think about various ways in which you can build in creative TVAs, like I kind of say in a lot of these videos where I talk about what framework teams should be doing in order to really create like some terminal defense that subsumes a lot of their concerns about how they fit under your model of the resolution, making arguments about how the workers' strike can still be related to the question of how settler colonialism arises. It doesn't completely jettison its history, but ask that question to be kind of conditioned around the specific demands that are slated under the resolution, and then kind of focusing in on why that's important with kind of different orientations that really allow that type of recognition, I think would be really interesting places to kind of start off like a really like nuanced engagement that changes from what you might have been doing on past resolutions before. Hopefully this is really helpful as a video that kind of sets up the other videos I'll be doing, talking a little bit more about settler colonialism and the workers' strike. And yeah, thanks as always for watching.